In this video, you're going to learn about cell transport. And cell transport is not a cell moving from one place to another, but instead we're thinking about materials moving across the cell membrane to either get into the cell or get out of the cell. And there's a lot of important real world applications for this, as far as things like, water is constantly moving in and out of your cells, and a person can get really sick and even die from not having enough water, dehydration, or overhydrating, surrounding themselves with too much water. Another important application of cell transport is how do our immune cells take in bacteria and other pathogens and actually engulf them into the cell to be able to fight those foreign invaders. So lots of important applications that we'll get to. And just, to start off with, let's answer this question of what are the cells moving? And to think about that, I want to look at this picture that compares the cell to a factory. And let's imagine that our cell, we're comparing it to, say, a cell phone factory. And a cell phone factory, in order to make cell phones, it is going to need to bring materials into the factory. It's going to need to bring in plastic and metal. And then I'm just going to move that a little bit there. It's also going to need to supply energy. So it's going to need to bring in electrical lines. But then also, we're going to have things that are leaving this factory. There's going to be waste produced, things that are collected and sent to the landfill, things that are sent to recycling centers. And then, of course, there'd be the cell phones shipped out. So there's constantly things coming in and out of the factory. And in the same way, in our cells, there are things moving in, including food, that are used to provide raw materials, building blocks, also to supply energy. And there's going to be wastes that are sent out. And it would be harmful to have build up inside the cell, and different products, things that the cell might make that needs to be sent somewhere else, that can be shipped out as well. So to talk about how things get across the cell membrane, we want to review the structure of cell membranes. And remember that cell membranes are mostly made up of phospholipids. So there's going to be a bilayer or two layers of phospholipids that forms the foundation of the cell membrane. And remember that a phospholipid looks kind of like this, kind of like a balloon with two tails coming off of it. And on the one side, we have the hydrophilic part. We call it the hydrophilic head. And this side is water loving. That's what hydrophilic means. So that side of the phospholipid likes to be around water. And then the hydrophobic tails on the other end, those are fatty acid chains, and they are water fearing. That's what hydrophobic means. They like to avoid water. All right. So looking down here, we can see the general picture of how the phospholipids organize themselves into the cell membrane. And inside of the cell, there would be water, and outside of the cell, there's water, and the tails are organized in the middle to avoid that water. But it's not just phospholipids that make up the cell membrane. There are other things mixed in there as well. So let's look at this diagram down here, and just again, to emphasize, we have, I'm going to keep it my red here. We have the hydrophilic heads. And then in the middle part of the membrane, you have the hydrophobic tails. They're nonpolar. There's no charge to them, and they want to avoid water. But then scattered in throughout the phospholipid bilayer, we have different proteins. Some of those proteins are what we call marker proteins that identify what kind of cell it is. These are also known as antigens. So they have little chains on them that mark the identity of the cell. Others might have holes or channels that allow for passageways. These are called transport proteins. And there's hundreds of different transport proteins that have different shapes that can allow different things to pass through. So different cells will have different shaped transport proteins because different cells need to be able to let different things in and out. And then this is a receptor protein that things can attach to. And that would allow for cells to be able to communicate with each other. Okay, so up here we have a description of each of those, and the first one was the marker proteins, and then we have, let's see, the color was purple. We have your receptor proteins that receive signals, and you have your transport proteins that are especially important for this section that can have specially shaped channels that allow for things to have kind of a shortcut across the cell membrane. And because there's all these different molecules that make up the cell membrane, and the membrane's very flexible, and actually the different proteins can kind of float around and move around within the phospholipid bilayer, scientists call this a fluid mosaic structure. All right, so now that we have our overview of the structure of the cell membrane, let's think more about things crossing from one side to the other. So the cell membrane is what we call selectively permeable. Think about like if a team or a school was selective, they would only let certain people join or enroll. And so the cell membrane is selective about what permeates or what passes through. And this is important for controlling the internal environment of the cell. It needs to keep things relatively constant. Remember, what's that term we use for living things? Maintaining a relatively stable internal environment. Homeostasis. So the cell membrane is key for the cell maintaining homeostasis. And overall, there's going to be two general terms that we use for the types of transport that occur. So when things do cross over that membrane, we will say that it's either passive transport or active transport. So passive transport is when something crosses over the cell membrane without the cell having to use energy. Okay, it doesn't need to spend any of its energy. Whereas with active transport, the cell does have to use energy to move the material across the cell membrane. And so we'll start with passive transport and then move on to active transport. So passive transport, or things moving across the membrane without the cell using energy, this type of transport is always going to be driven by diffusion. Okay, so we need to go over what diffusion is, because diffusion isn't something that just happens in cells. It's a broader term. Diffusion, important that we clarify this. Diffusion is when molecules, particles, anything moves from an area where there's more of it, where there's a higher concentration, to an area where there's less of it, where there's a lower concentration. We call this moving down the concentration gradient. Okay, so just generally, things have a tendency to space out, to spread out, to move to where there's more room. You can see a visual of this where when you add food coloring to water, at first the food coloring or dye molecules are all going to be tightly clustered together. But then as they randomly move about, they will end up pretty evenly spaced. Now, at this point here, they're pretty evenly spaced, but it's important to keep in mind that they'd still be moving around. It's not like they get spaced out and then they just stay still. And they'd still be bouncing around, moving around, but they'd be roughly evenly spread out. So here we can see how this is the area of high concentration where there's a lot of the dye molecules, and they start to space out to where at first there's no dye molecules. All right, so this principle of diffusion, or things spacing out, going from where there's a lot of it to where there's less of it, this is what drives passive transport in cells. Okay, so if there is something that can get through the cell membrane and there's more of it on one side than the other, like here, you can see how there's a high concentration of this blue molecule on the outside, and then there's a low concentration or amount of it on the inside. If that blue molecule can get through the cell membrane, it's going to overall move more in that direction of going in. Some of it will keep, moving out, but overall there's going to be a net movement in until we get an even distribution on both sides. And then at that point, you'd have an equal amount moving in and out. And that would be what we call reaching a state of equilibrium, where once there's an even concentration on both sides of the barrier, in this case, the cell membrane, an equal amount moves in each direction. Okay, so with passive transport, it's going to be diffusion occurring. And if it's something that can get directly through the cell membrane, we call that simple diffusion. Okay, so we can see here, this purple material is moving inside the cell to where there's less of it. And if it is small and nonpolar, if it doesn't have a charge, then it's going to be able to get through that lipid, fatty acid, hydrophobic part of the bilayer, and it'll be able to pass directly through, and it'll move in until there's an equal amount on both sides. There'll be a net movement in until there's an equal amount on both sides, and then it will move equally in both directions. But what if something is too big to squeeze directly through the bilayer? Or what if it does have a charge, like there's an ion or a molecule like water that's polar? Then it's not going to be able to go directly through the lipid bilayer, and it would have to use a transport protein, a channel that it would travel through. So the second type of passive transport is where the diffusion happens using a transport protein, and we call that facilitated diffusion. So anything that's too big to get right through the bilayer, or this should say charged, anything that's charged can pass through. And there's all different shapes of transport proteins, and different cells will have different ones, depending on what they need to be able to allow to get in and get out, and what they want to just keep out. All right, now number 3, the last one is really, it's just a specific example of facilitated diffusion. And this is called osmosis, and it's just where you have specifically the diffusion of water across the cell membrane. And it uses, you can see here, a transport protein that's specially shaped for water. It's called an aquaporin. And so water will be moving in and out of cells, and overall you'll have more water moving in the direction to where there's a lower water concentration. Okay, so